Hey, welcome to Scooby-Topia. I typically try on this channel to not directly cover a movie or episode twice if I can help it, unless the information in some small way is relevant to that video, as is often the case when discussing such a large franchise. It happens, however, that one villain from Scooby-Doo is so requested to be spotlighted as one of the scariest villains that I am having to partially break this rule and return to an episode I've discussed before. And as one might guess if you've seen the Scariest Villains videos before, it's another from the Scooby-Doo show. This episode also happens to pull from one of my longtime personal favorite stories, one I've referenced on the channel many times in the past as well, so I thought I would analyze this time how the episode utilizes the source material and look at that as well, so we have a proper reason to be here today. It was really only a matter of time with how often I bring it up. Today we head back to the Scooby-Doo show Season 1, Episode 5, The Headless Horseman of Halloween, airing October 9th, 1976. An episode so loved, not only can you get a nice figure or two of the guy, many toys actually, but it's been released on home video quite a lot, from the beloved Scooby-Doo Spookiest Tales release in 2001 that I've talked about before, the Scooby-Doo Favorite Frights DVD in 2015, or even the Best of 50th Anniversary DVD, not counting its inclusions on movie releases or the season set, etc. The Horseman is even one of the costumes displayed in the museum in 2004's Scooby-Doo 2 Monsters Unleashed, which would have been featured in a deleted scene and was originally going to be brought to life in the film before being scrapped at the last minute due to changing effects shops and budget cuts. These are some of the behind-the-scenes shots of making him the animatronic. It's just really cool to see, and you can see test footage here of the animatronic provided by Vincent Yoshida as well. It genuinely looks so impressive, and as a Sleepy Hollow enthusiast, I'm sad he didn't make it into the film. I would have really loved to see this. Here, we're going to find out just why this frightful equestrian without a head gave so many nightmares. But before we can understand how Scooby-Doo adapted this story, we need to take a look at it first. So let's head back to the 1800s, but without all the racists, as Taylor Swift once said. We'll just try and step around that too. So what is the Legend of Sleepy Hollow? Scooby has pulled from the story many times, even in modern years. The Headless Snowman episode of What's New Scooby-Doo, which I covered for Christmas before, is a holiday spin on the story, and the new Scooby-Doo movies episode, The Spooky Fog of Juneberry, years before this episode, utilized the Hessian soldier as well. This episode not only goes so far as to resurrect the infamous spirit of Sleepy Hollow, but sees the relatives of one Ichabod Crane be haunted specifically. So additionally, who is Ichabod Crane before we meet them? Firstly, the real little village of Sleepy Hollow, New York didn't start with that name. Instead, at the time of the story in question, it was known as Tarrytown, as noted in the text. In 1996, the name was officially changed to Sleepy Hollow in honor of the tale. From 1819 to 1820, American author Washington Irving would release a collection of short stories known as the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, or more simply known as the Sketchbook. The most famous stories, attributed to the fictional historian Dietrich Knickerbocker, were the tales of the Spectre Bridegroom, Rip Van Winkle, and of course, 1820's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The story has since been adapted in countless pieces of media, from a classic animated version by Walt Disney Animation Studios in 1949 that defined how it would be adapted forevermore, to even a Tim Burton reimagining in 1999. The story follows a lanky schoolmaster named Ichabod Crane who's kind of a piece of shit. All he cares about is eating tasty food, usually acquired from schmoozing the mothers of his students who believe him to be more sophisticated than he is, or fantastic riches. He sets his sights on the much younger Katrina Van Tassel, who happens to have a very wealthy father and could offer him both if he can win her hand in marriage. However, the hunky Brom Bones is already kind of her love interest that he has to fend off, and he becomes very jealous of the schoolmaster when Katrina starts to play along with Ichabod, mainly in hopes that it might get Brom to finally take action with her. Superstitious as he is greedy, Ichabod is often quite scared of spooks, much like Scooby. So when he hears the story of the Headless Horseman being out there one night, his way home from a party is ruined when he has a terrifying run-in with the ghost himself. He makes a gallant effort, but eventually the ghost catches up, and the village people only find a smashed pumpkin thrown at him the next morning. Obviously, the horseman caught poor Ichabod and spirited him away, the old wise would say. While Brom seems pretty full of himself, enough that other people assume it was probably him getting rid of the competition and simply scaring Ichabod off, especially since he finally marries Katrina. People even claim to see Ichabod outside of Sleepy Hollow, married with a wife that keeps him plenty fed and happy. That's basically the story as it's relevant to know here. Now that we've covered the very basics of it, let's see how Scooby built on that for this classic episode, and how it serves as a sequel to it. I'm not going to discuss the entirety of it, as I talked about much of it at length in my Scooby-Doo family tree video before, so anything to do with my sweet Scooby-Dum will be left alone this time when not relevant. If you want to hear about him, go to that video. I do love him. Right out of the gate, the episode sets an unsettling tone against the visuals of this mansion with this music. Just take a listen. While people inside party the night away, we immediately get to business and show the Headless Horseman himself, back to terrorize Sleepy Hollow again. And once again, just listen to the combination of the music and the horse for what truly cements an episode ready to haunt dreams forevermore. Back at the party, the dancing continues as the boys thank Gertrude Crane, the aunt of Beth Crane, friend of the gang who invited them to join the party. The boys, with Scooby's cousin Scooby-Dum, accidentally referred to as his brother here, end up following an apple outside where they hear the frightening sound of the horse. Of course, looking over, they find the horseman himself speeding toward them on his steed, getting a good frightful look at them, then returning from whence he came. The rest of the gang meanwhile are inside talking to Beth, who is voiced by none other than Janet Waldo herself, who's been brought up in so many videos on my channel at this point that I've lost count, often as a different friend of theirs. She even voices her Aunt Gertrude that we saw earlier, so she's doing really talented double duty. She tells them that the portrait above is of her great-great-grandfather Ichabod Crane. We can definitely see that the Scoobyverse depiction of Ichabod is quite similar to how he's often depicted in illustrations or films such as the Disney version. The only big change really being his glasses, which at first glance one might assume to be to distinguish that he's older here, and that he did go on to have a family, such as assumed in the rumors that he moved away and married, presumably rich, which would also check out with Gertrude's wealth. We would then assume that Ichabod eventually moved back to Sleepy Hollow later, right? That's what would make sense.
You mean the Ichabod Crane, who lived here in Sleepy Hollow until
one dark night, along the road to the cemetery, he found himself being chased by
a Headless Horseman!
However, that seems not to be the case. I started doubting myself and had a mini breakdown trying to parse the continuity here for a moment, so let me try and explain. Beth explains that the boys seeing the ghost means the horseman is back to haunt them. As it turns out, at least to the family, the story of the horseman's ghost is true. She tells the classic folklore of a Hessian soldier being killed in the Revolutionary War, losing his head that was never found. His headless body was burned in the cemetery just down the road. Per usual, the book tells that he comes out during midnights to search for a new head, which is why he chased Ichabod that fateful night. Here's where I got confused though, because Velma of course asks what happened to him, and Beth reveals that nobody in Sleepy Hollow ever saw him again after that specific night and encounter with the ghost. First of all, in this universe, the village is actually named Sleepy Hollow, which was not the case in 1976. That would take 2 more decades. More importantly, the Scoobyverse is telling us that Ichabod really did get spirited away that night, because if he was never seen again, where did he go? He didn't have a family in the original story, so having one and leaving them behind to have a happy life elsewhere would make much less sense than it does in the original story, especially if he's leaving behind a wealthy wife and kids. That's what's tripping me up here, because in the original story, Ichabod very much was not wed, not to Katrina nor any other woman, when he disappeared, and he did disappear at the usual time here, but if he's specifically Beth's great-great-grandfather, as she says many times, not her great-great-uncle or anything else, that implies that he was wed and had a child, which Beth comes from the pipeline of. This is the first time to my knowledge that Ichabod has ever been depicted to have lineage of any kind prior. I'm kind of baffled trying to figure out why the episode made this decision because it just does not make sense. But this also is speaking from the standpoint of someone that enjoys the original Sleepy Hollow story and knows it so well. I'm sure if you don't care, especially as a kid, this wouldn't bother you at all, but that's why I'm here, to look at how the episode took from the original story and be nitpicky. So I'm going to be the one to ask these silly little questions. Fred assumes the boys just saw a costume, after all it's a costume party, and they go about their night. However, the lights go out and the ghostly horseman throws open the doors, screaming that he wants a head. He doesn't really do much though, as everyone but the gang and Cranes run away, and the horseman just rides off again. Thelma is sent with the 3 boys to check upstairs for clues, though I don't know why they expect to find him up there considering that he rode off. I guess they're right though, as he jumps out and gives a little cackle.
I want a head!
He asks for theirs, but gets his cape caught on the sewing machine.
No cakes!
The boys tell the others they caught him, but it seems he got away. However, he did leave behind a clue, several wood chips, and Gertrude awakens to a ghostly hand reaching out, and Beth's cousin Elwood insists it was reaching for the necklace, and she should keep it safe in the bank vault, as the diamond is what triggered the horseman. Much like his relative Ichabod, she calls him superstitious, especially for a businessman who runs a large company like Apex International Shoes. Dum accidentally triggers the butler Tarloff, who suspiciously has ghostly white hands he explains to be from powdered sugar, confirmed by Scooby's tongue. Elwood Elwood is fed up and says he's taking the diamond to the vault himself tonight, even though it's not open. He says the manager is a friend of his, so he'll just phone him up, and she offers up the necklace. He heads out, saying he called the manager, disappearing into the foggy night as a screech is heard, and the horseman rides back out of the fog, having taken Elwood's head. To an adult, it's probably obvious what the twist will be from here, clearly, but to a child, the implication that the horseman took his head can be quite frightening. After he rides off, they inspect his car where they find only the pumpkin head and a pile of clothes, which the ghost seems to have neatly folded up for him. You'd think there'd be a headless body of Elwood or something, but this is quite tidy. Fred tells the cranes to go back inside for safety, and this is weirdly the last time we ever physically see Beth for the rest of the episode despite her prominence. Especially odd when there's still nearly 10 minutes left by this point. Dum accidentally finds a clue, a tiny picture of Elwood with glue on the opposite side, while Fred finds that the ghost for some reason took the ignition key, despite probably not knowing what a car is, nor having a need for one, considering he's a horseman. The dogs find another potential clue, a newspaper clipping.
Flying saucer lands at Beautician's convention.
Shaggy decides to save this despite Velma's skepticism. Fred next decides they need to see the horseman's grave, and Velma notes when they reach the point where he spirited away Ichabod, just in time for another figure to approach. Thankfully, it's the butler Tarloff returning from reporting their power failure to the closest neighbor. Daphne asks why he didn't just call the power company, like Elwood called the bank manager earlier, but Tarloff reveals the tree that knocked down the power lines took out the telephone lines as well. Fred assumes the wind must have done it, but instead it appears it was actually chopped down with an axe and done on purpose. Fred realizes this explains the wood chips from earlier. At the cemetery, they find the crypt supposedly housing the horseman, and Fred tries to desecrate the resting place. Not the first time I've seen them do this on the channel, which would probably summon a real ghost if it were around, but they ultimately find nothing, which Fred deems to be a clue itself. Shaggy still thinks his paper is important, which Velma finally realizes is true, and Fred is putting the big picture together as well. They run back to the van and speed off to the airport, which Fred tells Daphne is where the horseman will be. He isn't inside yet, Velma supposing he's waiting for the fog to lift first, so they set up a trap and wait for him. He eventually rides up and gets in position, but clumsy Scooby falls and lands in the plane with him, ruining the trap, and also the flight as the plane speeds around in circles. With Shaggy falling in as well, it flies up into the sky, the horseman trying to catch them mid-air. The flight getting even worse, the plane eventually starts falling apart until all three of them fall, safely into the net held by Scooby-Dum, thankfully. Shaggy tries to do the classic unmasking, but there's no mask. Obviously, it's actually just Elwood. He really just wanted to steal Gertrude's expensive diamond and get away. The gang explain how they figured it out to Beth and Gertrude, though again, we don't see Beth for some reason, we just hear her off-screen weirdly. The ghost taking the keys was something Elwood did out of habit, giving himself away for the first clue, the picture of him with glue on the back being for his passport photo to escape to another country. Elwood couldn't have used their phone to call the bank manager either, because Tarloff revealed the phone lines to be down. Shaggy's clue, however, turned out to be the most important. Turns out, the other side reveals that Elwood's company went bankrupt, leaving Elwood penniless and giving a motive to steal such an expensive diamond. And so ends the mystery of the Headless Horseman of Halloween. Although, it doesn't wrap up the mystery of the original horseman, because one still actually chased and spirited away poor Ichabod in the canon of the episode. We can't really forget that still stands and is not addressed. Either way, that is the Headless Horseman of Halloween, and how the villain and his episode pulled from Washington Irving's original text. There's not much need to figure out why and how this villain sticks with people enough to be one of the scariest and most iconic villains. The Headless Horseman is already all of that in any version of the story, Scooby-Doo or otherwise. A headless ghost that wants to chase and kill you so it can take your head for its own is terrifying, especially to a younger audience. And in the episode, for a good while, he even seemingly does it successfully to Elwood. The episode surprisingly has some spooky music cues and sound effects as well, more than most episodes, used to pretty great effect. And the Halloween setting helps to solidify the mood as much as the perfect setting that is Sleepy Hollow, even if we mostly don't really get to see the luscious backdrops usually associated with it in the story, just a lot of darkness and fog. The cemetery is a pretty fantastic setting for the little time we have it though, and while I skipped over him, Scooby-Dum is surprisingly competent in this episode. There's really not too much to say about it. I think we all know what makes the horseman tick. I hope you enjoyed this little ride through Terrytown with me, more than Ichabod at least. We should wrap this video up now, shouldn't we? If you liked the video, hit the like button obviously. Subscribe if you want to see the next video. Follow me on socials, including even Tumblr and TikTok before it's banned if you want. I'll see you next time in Scooby-Topia. Bye!